hospital medicine at Children's National Medical Center, and she's the director of our Pediatric Hospital Medicine Fellowship. Dr. Shah has been instrumental in the recognition of pediatric hospital medicine as a subspecialty by the American Board of Pediatrics and serves on the inaugural Pediatric Hospital Medicine Subboard. Dr. Shah has been a member of the Children's Academy of Pediatric Educators for nearly a decade, and the project she will be talking about was a recipient of a National Award for Innovation in Education at the 2015 Pediatric Hospital Medicine Conference. On behalf of the Education SIG and CAPE, I turn it over to Dr. Shah.
Hey everyone, thanks for joining today. And thank you, Prit, for the introduction, and to the SIG for allowing me to come talk about my research today. So I'll just jump right in. What I hope to talk to you guys about today is a little bit of what my journey has been in medical education scholarship. And I'm going to do that in terms of describing how I translated what I was doing in my everyday teaching and my everyday curricular endeavors into educational scholarship by using one curriculum that I developed with colleagues as an example of that. And then to talk a little bit about the challenges and the successes that we faced along the way. So we'll start by talking about the study. This was a web-based multimedia curriculum for hospitalists and trainees on care of the medically complex child. It all started with a series of new clinical service lines that our division was tasked with implementing that focused on children with medical complexity. So several years ago now, we initiated a contract with HSC Pediatric Center. Those of you who are familiar with it know that it's a subacute and rehab medical facility that is about 2 or 3 miles down the road from here at the main campus. And we really were going to be primarily involved with providing subacute medical and rehab services to inpatients there. And most of them were neurologically impaired children. Some of them were technology dependent. And I, along with others, quickly realized after learning that, that there was a knowledge and skills gap that needed to be addressed for our hospitalist group as we began care of this patient population. And so the complex care curriculum came to be. We essentially internally crowdsourced a series of multimedia modules using PowerPoint. So very basic audiovisual modules that covered highly desired content that was specific to care of this population of patients. And in addition, a small group of us also created low fidelity simulation cases related to emergencies that were common to devices found in this patient population. Some of them were actually based off of M&M cases from real life emergencies that happened here at this institution. And so all of this was really to get at like gearing up quickly for practical tips on how to care for these patients that were grounded in the evidence around those diagnoses. So after the initial set of modules was created and we were using them for our patient care, we realized that this material was really going to be necessary for all pediatric trainees to receive as well, because at that time we were starting to see growth of this specific patient population on the inpatient side. So we decided to study it. The objective of the study really was to evaluate satisfaction, knowledge impact, and behavior change after participating in this online curriculum that was focused on care of these patients. And it was composed of not only multimedia learning modules, but also virtual simulation activities. And we compared that to the more traditional format of print media. This was a prospective randomized controlled trial of pediatrics and internal medicine pediatrics residents from across the country. Any resident was really eligible to participate as long as they were in good standing with their program. And we collected data over 2 study periods. Program directors who are members of the Association of Pediatric Program Directors were solicited by email to introduce the study to their trainees. And they were also invited to review the curriculum before we actually sort of rolled it out to the residents. And interested programs were asked to identify a site coordinator that could help collect names and email addresses of each of the participants so that we could then send information for how they could log into the curriculum and take it. We did some face-to-face informed consent. We waived face-to-face informed consent in lieu of using this online curriculum. And that allowed us to be very geographically diverse. And at first attempted login of the curriculum, they were provided with information sheet for the study and were asked to opt in or opt out of using the results of their surveys for research purposes. And so they received detailed instructions via an email on how to access the curriculum and a timeline for completion. And periodically we sent email reminders to encourage them to sort of log back on and check what their status was. And also a way to contact us if there were any technical difficulties. So in terms of the actual curriculum, I think this was in particular pretty innovative in terms of how we made this a randomized control trial. I mean, you know, for us, really, we're so used to sort of doing the experimental group and then the control group. And when we first talked about this, you know, that would have meant that the experimental group would have received all the modules and the control group would have gotten all the readings. And I just thought, if I was, ooh, it just went dark in here. If I was in the control group, it'd be kind of boring to just get all the readings and not actually get to see what this curriculum is about. So our study team actually came up with the idea to crisscross this a little bit. And so the curriculum itself was composed of 6 self-paced multimedia modules, and then a concurrent group of topic-specific readings that were all based on common learning objectives for these 6 topics that you see listed here on the slide. But what we did was we allowed each group to receive 3 modules each and then 3 sets of readings, and both of those were mutually exclusive. So if I were in group A, I would get the VP Shunts module, and if I were in group B, I would have gotten the VP Shunts readings. Likewise, if I was in group A, I got tracheostomy readings, but in group B, I would get tracheostomy module. And so this allowed everybody who participated to see a subset of the modules and get an opportunity to participate and sort of benefit from that as well. We collected pre and post assessments. They were composed of multiple choice questions that really were geared towards testing the knowledge that we were aiming to achieve by delivering the content in these modules. We also collected satisfaction data. And then in terms of the virtual activities, which I'll talk a little bit more about in detail later, we had a simulated verbal handoff of a patient, as well as the virtual simulation of a device-related emergency of a fictional child with medical complexity. There was a final evaluation survey that was composed of Likert-based questions and statements, as well as some short answer comment boxes that allowed them to free text a lot about sort of their thoughts and opinions on the entire curriculum and their overall satisfaction. So at the outset, we enrolled 440 some in the curriculum, and that comprised 56 distinct training programs across the United States. Of those, about 50% actually completed the entire curriculum and were included in the analysis. There were no significant differences between the 2 study groups with respect to gender, year of training, or type of residency program. And of the 225 participants that completed the final evaluation of the curriculum, there were several questions related to satisfaction. And so what we found was that overall, the vast majority of people that participated were satisfied with the actual content. More of the participants felt that the modules were a good use of their time when compared to readings. And of note, with respect to comfort with clinical care, when they were asked to respond to the statement, this curriculum improved my comfort in caring for patients with X diagnosis, those who received modules were more likely to agree or strongly agree with that statement if they received a module versus if they received a reading. And so this finding was actually statistically significant for all of the topics that we covered in the curriculum. And then in terms of looking at knowledge, right? So when we sort of analyzed the responses to the 33 multiple choice questions that were on, that covered the span of the topics in the curriculum, what we found is sort of overall, they were essentially showing us that there was a statistically significant increase in knowledge when we looked at before curriculum and after curriculum. And to ensure that one group wasn't performing differently than another, we also did a breakdown by group. So as I described earlier, group A and group B, you can see here very similar pre-test scores and post-test scores, again, both statistically significant changes. And then in addition, there was no significant difference between their pre-test scores across the groups, suggesting that really both of the groups of participants had similar baseline knowledge. So it's not like there was a difference in what they knew coming into this curriculum. And then in order to assess whether or not change in pre to post test scores was related to the method of delivery, we analyzed the mean difference in scores for each topic. So as you recall, some people received a module on a topic and some people received a reading. So we wanted to look at whether or not there was a difference in knowledge score based on that. But as you can see from this table, the module mean difference in score was higher for each of the 6 topics when compared to the reading mean difference in score. This finding was statistically significant for 2 topics, dysautonomia and enteric feeding tubes. So really, to me, what this suggests is that taking a module had a higher impact on knowledge than reading in this particular study. Let's pause here just to talk a little bit about assessment of behavior change. And so we utilized what I think were 2 very unique things that we added to this curriculum to really try to get at a higher level of assessment and looking at whether or not in real time, in stimulated environment, could the participant apply knowledge that may have been gained from this curriculum. And so what I've listed here is just some snapshots of what this actually looked like in real time. So there was a simulated verbal handoff exercise where essentially we used an audio voice capture plugin that allowed the participant to record themselves providing a handoff of a particular patient as if they were signing the patient out to their colleague. And the way that we tried to create reality around this was that they were provided with an electronic medical record of a fictional patient that included all the typical stuff that you would see in the EMR for a patient like this. They were then asked to compose their handoff in whatever way that they have standardized their handoff at their own training institution, and then to record themselves providing this handoff to a virtual trainee who would be overtaking the care of that patient. Those handoff files, those audio files, were then analyzed by members of our research team using a validated checklist of information that we thought was relevant to be included for patients with medical complexity. And then they were provided a score for that. And then the simulated virtual device related emergency were actually virtual scenarios that were based off the original set of low fidelity simulation exercises that we had put together. There were 4 cases in total. 3 of them were turned into virtual simulations online with the help of our instructional design team at the time. So what you'll see here is snapshots of that on this slide. So what that actually looked like in the stepwise progression that you would go through to sort of get to the bottom of the emergency. So in terms of the results for the behavior change exercise, you know, each participant really went through these different exercises, and then we, as I mentioned, we utilized research assistants to help us score. We did do inter-rater reliability testing to establish that the 3 assistants that were grading these were doing so appropriately, and the CAPEX statistic for that was 0.89 after we reconciled discrepancies and had sort of 2 or 3 additional meetings with those research assistants to discuss what the discrepancies were and to come to consensus. So 56 participants actually completed both the pre and post verbal handoff recordings, and they were included in the analysis. There was a significant increase in the handoff score after completing this curriculum, though unclear if educationally significant. Not a primary aim of this study, these findings suggest that participants were translating knowledge gained into their handoffs and really changing the composition of their handoff after having taken this curriculum. The topic-specific analysis was conducted utilizing non-parametric tests to determine if there were particular topic areas that were associated with higher post-handoff scores. But ultimately, in the end, you know, the number wasn't high enough for us to make any statistical inference. And then in terms of the actual virtual emergency simulation, there were 3 virtual simulation cases, as I had mentioned previously. One was on gastrostomy tubes, the other on tracheostomy tubes, and then finally on ventricular peritoneal shunts. And each case had one terminal action that led directly to identification of the device malfunction and therefore ended the scenario. So the focus was really on diagnosis rather than management due to software limitations and the original learning objective of the curriculum. So for example, in the tracheostomy case, the terminal action was changing the tracheostomy tube, which identified a mucus plug as the cause of the acute respiratory distress. Likewise, in the G-tube case, the terminal action was the G-tube dye study, which showed extravasation of the dye into the peritoneum of the patient, the reason for the acute abdomen and the ultimately what was found to be malposition of the G-tube. So analysis was by pooled comparisons. No participant received the same case twice. So what happened was you were randomized to receive a case pre-curriculum and then a different case post-curriculum. Depending on which case you received pre and post-curriculum, the software captured up to 60 actions. Temporal data was not available. And interestingly, there was a substantial difference in the number of participants achieving terminal action for the tracheostomy case, 80% when compared to the G-tube and the VP shunt case prior to and after completing the curriculum. Perhaps this indicates potential area of focus for future education and training. But when comparing pre to post performance in terms of reaching the terminal action, only the participants that took the VP shunt case had a higher percentage of participants achieving the terminal action after reviewing the curriculum. Though this finding did not reach statistical significance, and the G-tube and the trach cases had sort of similar findings pre and post, and so we weren't able to sort of evaluate that with this particular group of participants. Sub-analysis comparing performance after taking a module versus reading did not show any significant differences or trends for any of the 3 cases. So likewise, as we did for the modules, we wanted to see if there was a difference if you received readings versus modules, and there really wasn't. Further analysis looking categorically at how many actions it took to get to the terminal action did not provide any significant findings. So when we broke it down and looked at how many steps people were taking until they got to the terminal action, there was no significant difference. So pre-curriculum, they weren't necessarily taking more steps or doing more things before they ultimately ended up with the final diagnosis than post-curriculum. So ultimately, in this large multi-site randomized trial, participating residents reported high satisfaction and demonstrated significant gain in knowledge, some change in behavior after participating in this online curriculum. As far as the authors are aware, this was the first study of its kind to assess behavior change in a virtually simulated environment. I think that's what makes the study so unique and frankly, so much fun for us to do. With respect to performance on verbal handoff simulation, again, we talked about a statistically significant increase in the handoff score after participating in the curriculum. And although this wasn't a primary aim of the study, this finding suggests that participation in this curriculum did impact behavior after the participant completed it. And then finally, as we discussed with virtual emergency simulation, the VP case participants did have a higher likelihood of achieving the terminal action after the participation in the curriculum, but it did not reach statistical significance. And then in terms of strengths and limitations, I'll just say, the strengths, I think one of the biggest strengths of this curriculum was the fact that we had so many participants from so many different centers across the United States. It really allowed us to sort of get a good grasp on what was happening across the board in terms of residency training, and specifically in terms of reaching groups of people that have variable access to educational resources related to this population of patients. We included all training levels, and we had assessment that was built into this curriculum that really addressed a higher level of evaluation. Limitations, of course, were completion rates. So as you saw from the beginning, of the 400 participants, only 50% actually completed it. Not surprising given how busy residents are during their training, right? So in fact, I was even impressed that we got that many people to finish it. It was pretty intense training that we were asking them to do, and it was time limited. There were lots of technical difficulties along the way. As you can imagine, using new technology is always, it's always sort of a growth and learning curve for not just the people that are actually creating the curriculum, but then the people that are actually using it. We didn't have any built-in way to assess patient outcomes. That was not something that we were able to achieve during this study. And then there were some limitations with the software that we were using in terms of how fancy we could get with a virtual simulation. So, as we had set it up, it didn't really mimic real life for obvious reasons. A lot of the time you're not taking one step after one step after one step. In a real live emergency, you'll be doing multiple things at a time. So that was something that came up a lot in the survey that we provided afterwards in terms of comments from the participants. While program directors are challenged with achieving service education balance, we thought this was a really nice way to offer augmented learning for their residents. And it's asynchronous in nature, so really they could use it whenever they want to, not just when they're off the wards, sort of with their free time or their educational time, but also just in time when they're actually patient facing. So let's talk a little bit about successes and challenges here. You know, I think the best piece of advice I ever received was to conduct my project with, in a way that would allow for me to turn all the things that I'm doing every day with my teaching into scholarship. And so really looking at the end or the outcome from the very beginning and keeping assessment and evaluation at the forefront of the conversation. So what's really been integral to the rigor of the work that I just presented to you all was the methodological approach that I utilized, which was Kern's framework that I have up here. And so this really was, I think, the driving force for the success of this study. And in sort of looking back, you know, in hindsight, the environment at the time was really just right for this initiative. The timing was perfect. There was, at the time, a change in inpatient demographic. There was an impetus for this type of curriculum with very little evidence in the way of best practices, and also very few resources related to this specific population of patients. And then, you know, with variable shifts in scheduling, both for trainees and for us as hospitalists, we needed something that could be accessed asynchronously and sort of address this more modern era, utilizing technology to maximize what we can do in terms of education. And then in terms of the other sort of piece of success, or the tip that I sort of would give to others if they were trying to embark on this, is really to do a targeted needs assessment. That's part of the 6-step model for curriculum development. But in anything that you do in education, it feels to me to really utilize the adult learning principle of asking your audience what they're looking for. And this really lets them decide what's important and what's desired. And taking that into account was another aspect of this work that resulted in sort of successful uptake of the curriculum and high satisfaction with it. And then finally, thinking about our educational strategies in terms of how we were going to evaluate and assess the impact was the other driving force for success. So this is Kirkpatrick's levels of evaluation, and some of you may be very familiar with this, and others of you may have not seen this in the past. But I think what's important to take note of here is that we knew that it wouldn't be difficult to achieve number 1 and number 2, which is really related to satisfaction with a particular initiative and then knowledge impact. That's standard for most curricular interventions. What's harder is number 3 and number 4, so really getting at behavior and then finally getting at outcomes. And so in this respect, we used the technology that was available to us and in the innovation from our instructional design team to help us really try to get a little bit more at level 3, which was how are they actually implementing the knowledge or applying the knowledge to an actual virtual simulation as they sort of progress through this virtual world. And our hope was that that would at least translate in some respect to how they may apply it in the real world for their actual patients. And then there were several other things, of course, that, you know, serendipity, of course, had it all happen at the same time. And I think, you know, return on investment was a big one for the authors. As I mentioned early on, this was crowdsourced. So we're a very clinically busy division, and many of us are actually highly clinical. And so this was sort of passion projects for many of us, and people really took the initiative to develop sound content, and it took time and effort. And so in return, what we did was, as a study team, was we developed a rubric by which they could ultimately end up publishing the work in MedEd portal. And that allowed for them to add to their academic portfolio as well. And so I think establishing that return on investment for our authors was key to keeping them engaged and also keeping them going when they were so busy clinically. I think from an institution standpoint, I had a lot of support through CAPE and through the educational leadership of the program. We had an e-learning team at the time, and that was a huge boon for us because really none of this would have been possible without their input and their help. And in addition, at the time, the leader of that instructional design team was someone who had a degree in education as well. And so the crosstalk was really easy. You know, he understood educational concepts. It was easier for us to establish the method by which we would deliver this curriculum online. And then we leveraged the support of a national organization to really get at the participants. So by engaging the program directors through APBD, it was helpful for us to be able to then get the participants to actually commit to doing the curriculum. And in addition, the financial support, of course, was very helpful. And you know, educational grants are not easy, and it took a lot of time for us to find it, and along the way applying to different things and, you know, getting rejected, but then ultimately getting some support for our study was really helpful. And then, you know, sort of the village, and that's sort of the primary place where I think I survived in terms of having people around me that really held me accountable to this study and helped me to see new and different ways of doing this. I think in terms of challenges, there were so many. I already mentioned some of those that were inherent to the technology that we were using. I think when I think about big picture, you know, what were some of the big things that are still outstanding that that were difficult for us to address? These three things came to mind. We'd never really fully vetted a plan for sustainability. And this was really tough for us, and I think is the reason why these modules and the curriculum itself sort of went defunct after this study. We were very reliant on the technology part for this particular curriculum. So with changes in technology and changes in our instructional design team, it was really hard to maintain the platform for continued use. And in fact, since the time of the curriculum is actually built in Flash. And I don't know if you guys are familiar. I have a very low level understanding of the technology. So just, you know, that's my disclaimer. But Flash was phased out, and now the new normal for the web is HTML5. So what that meant for us is that all of the content in the curriculum needed to be converted to HTML5, but there was no manpower that existed to do that. Advanced technology also sometimes requires that you have IP agreements, so intellectual property. You know, the simulation cases that were created for this curriculum required the instructional designer to actually write de novo code for those simulations, stuff that had never been written before. So who owns that? And the process of trying to figure it out was also very difficult. And I think, you know, in the end, we experienced something that one of my colleagues has coined death by delay. And so essentially after multiple sort of email and meeting conversations around IP and who owns the code and all of that, it ultimately came down to nothing, and it was left unresolved. So I think had I to do it over again, I would have had those discussions much earlier in the process before we established the curriculum, make sure that it was all sort of hashed out before. And then finally, the content in the curriculum. So there wasn't a lot of standards for practice for this patient population, but over time, you know, it's been many years since then. Over time, there is new literature and new information. And so exploration of the content or the validity of the content is another real issue. You know, how we can sort of keep these up to date and keep them in line with what is current in the literature was another piece of this that was never fully addressed by our study team. So one of the ways recently that we are trying to overcome some of these challenges that we have faced is through a partnership with OpenPediatrics. If you're not familiar with OpenPediatrics, it's an open source repository of educational materials that is run through Harvard. And I actually have a partner over there, a colleague that had reached out to me after seeing our work in complex care and asked if we could actually enter into a joint venture where our curriculum could be hosted on OpenPediatrics. I was ecstatic because that solved a lot of my problems. But there was so much more that was gained from that collaboration. So through this connection, not only are we now beginning to publish our modules on their website, but they're also undergoing another evaluation and another update with peer review. So using some of their experts at Harvard. So not only are we utilizing the expertise that was originally grown from here and re-engaging our content authors, but we're also now having somebodies outside of the institution peer review this content. And to me, that just lends even more credibility to the content that's in the modules. And then they also have, you know, extensive instructional design and production resources that we just didn't have at the time. And they're going to be much more capable of sustaining these modules in a space where people can access them freely. And then tips for success, I've already mentioned several of those, but really it takes a village, and I have an amazing village. It really would not have been at all possible on my own, or even just the few of us on the study team. There were many, many people who really contributed to this project and its success. And I think the other thing was, approaching this with the end in mind. And so the advice that I received early on with this project idea was to really be forward thinking and goal oriented in terms of looking into the future. What did we really want to assess in terms of outcomes? And that was really helpful for setting up an infrastructure and a framework for how to study this. And then, creating my own SOC. For those of you that are in medical education, you might be familiar with scholarship oversight committees. And so these are committees that are formed for trainees that help them to conduct their fellowship research projects. And what I found that, as someone that was sort of young and then moving into mid-career, I don't have a built-in SOC unless I make my own SOC. So that's what I did. So my study team was comprised of individuals that really were not just experts and champions for me, but really were there to hold me accountable and to look at this through different lenses to allow me to really make the most robust study that I could. And then don't leave any stone unturned. I think, funds are few and far between, but they're there. And if you take the time and you take the effort, you can find the funding. And then money's not always everything, I think in this particular curriculum, because we sometimes utilize durable equipment for some of our training. I literally got on the phone with our reps from different companies like Medtronic and Kimberly-Clark and just asked, do you have educational resources? Do you have things that we can utilize to become part of this curriculum? And I received, I actually got a whole box from the Medtronic rep full of intrathecal baclofen pump dummy pumps and BP shunt dummy shunts, and like a little mannequin that you could actually stimulate tapping the shunt reservoir on. It literally came to my office and I was just so shocked and impressed. And we still use these materials for hands-on education for our trainees. So sometimes it's just about thinking about the outside the box and really just asking people for help. And it really has been the gift that keeps on giving, to be honest. We have had collaborations for additional modules with people at different institutions. So once the word got out, there were people that were reaching out to me to make additional modules on additional topics. I've had several REACH mentees, so through the REACH program here at Children's National, medical student mentees, and then subsequently projects by other trainees that utilize portions of this curriculum that were successful and published. There were 9 total modules that were published on Meta Portal, and we're starting to add modules to OpenPediatrics, as I mentioned. Multiple national and international workshops, including PAS and the AAP and CE, as well as recognition, as a top medical educational article at PAS just in 2019. So this most recent, not this one, but the most recent live PAS meeting. And then new collaboration again with OpenPediatrics. And then as well through that same contact, we're working as a national group to define competency in complex care by creating EPA specific to trainees with this patient population. It was primarily the basis for my promotion in 2016, my academic promotion. And then finally, I think perhaps the thing that really hit home the most for me was a story that I'll tell you that one of our study team members, Dr. Bensali, mentioned to me. I think this was from a few years ago. She was on service, on the inpatient service, and she had an intern who was from an outside program rotating with her, and they were seeing a patient and the family. The patient had just recently had a gastrostomy tube placed, and the family had a lot of questions in the room during family-centered rounds. And so as the questions started coming after the initial presentation by the students and the interns, she got ready to jump in and begin to answer those questions for the family when the intern actually started answering those questions and adeptly managed a lot of the conversation. And so when the encounter concluded and the team walked out of the room, she sort of thought to herself, wow, that's so interesting that this intern has that high level of knowledge of the G-tube. And so just prompted and questioned the intern saying, hey, you know a lot about G-tubes, like how did you learn all that stuff? And the resident said, yeah, my program director made me take these modules, so that's how I know. And it turns out that those modules were actually part of this curriculum. And so they were a study site that participated in this curriculum. And I think out of everything else that I've experienced in this particular journey, that was the thing that hit home the most, that we were able to have impact at the level of the trainee who was interacting with the family. So I've been talking a lot and very fast because I just had a very large cup of coffee. So I apologize for the rapid pace, but I'm happy to answer any questions that you guys might have about this curriculum.
Dr. Shah, it looks like someone from the chat room, I think you were talking about test results. Results from knowledge. Something about 11 or 12, the score is 11 or 12 out of what?
I think that referred to the scoring rubric for the virtual handoff. Can you go back?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So the virtual handoff scoring rubric ultimately had, I think, around 29 or 30 items. Maybe I can go back to that slide, actually, that might be helpful so we can just see it in context. Hold on one second, I'm going to share my screen again. Okay, let me know if I go back to the right thing here. This one, right?
Yep.
Okay, great. So, and would you mind repeating the question one more time for me, please?
I think the question is, you mentioned that the scores are 11 and 12, that I think the denominator is not known.
Right, so I apologize. So if you see here, 29 point validated checklist, so it was just a one-to-one score. So what we're saying is that of the 29 items that were on the checklist, the pre-test inclusion of those items, there were on average 11 of those items included in the handoff. And then afterwards there were 12. So hence, you know, what we see is statistical significance, but I just don't know educational wise how much impact that really has, right? So some of this might lead one to sort of say, yeah, but that's just one additional thing that was included in the handoff. And we did not have the ability to sort of take a look at individual handoffs to see, was that a key component, like something that would lead to a poor patient outcome if it wasn't known. And so that's certainly an area ripe for future investigation, but at the drill down level, I hope this addresses the question that was posted.
Can I ask a question out loud?
Sure. Who's that?
This is Robin Dorshow.
Hi, Robin.
That was a wonderful presentation. I actually have 100 questions, but I will not ask all of them.
Okay.
But I have two major questions. And one is to tell us a little bit more about how you even got 50% participation from residents, because this is something that is astonishing. Yeah. That's number one. And then number two is, I'd like to know a little bit more about the two interventions. How much time did they spend on the one thing versus the other? If they did reading, was there something interactive like questions to answer or something like that, or did they just read? So kind of get a sense of what the difference is between the two methods.
Sure. I'll start there. So because, you know, in the satisfaction survey, this was actually a point that came up by a lot of the participants. The readings were just readings. So they were literally PDF versions of the key articles. There were 2 to 3 articles for each topic. And they were the primary resource by which the module was based off of. So the learning objectives came from the readings, and then the content in the modules mirrored what was in those readings. There were no questions associated with this. There was no interactivity whatsoever. So it's as if you just opened up a journal and started reading the article. And then the modules, so like time-wise, the modules were about, you know, on average 35 minutes. Some of them were a little bit longer than that. I suspect that reading the 2 or 3 articles would have taken someone about the same amount of time, but in looking at the survey responses from the individuals, it seems like the impression that they had or the perception that they had was that it took longer to do the readings. And so for that reason, they were more likely to not do all of the readings in the content, sort of in that content area, particular content area. And so that was sort of the difference between the two groups. And likewise with the module, there were no prompting questions in the modules. The interactivity piece of it really was just the addition of the audio-visual aspect, and outside of that, there wasn't anything else. So hopefully that answers the second question. In terms of the first question, the 50%. So interestingly, you know, we were all surprised by that too. But interestingly, I think there were several program directors who reached back out to me, and the stance that we took was we were open to how they wanted to implement it. You know, a lot of the initial questions that we got were, you know, this is going to be hard for people to commit to, you know, what are you looking for? And we sort of said, you know, we're not asking you to require all of your trainees to do this unless you feel that this curriculum is important for them to all do. And what ended up happening was I had a handful of programs write me back and say, we want them all to do this. We want it to be a requirement. That's what we're going to say to our trainees. And this program was one of those programs. So that definitely helped. And you know, what we allowed for in the learning platform was that they would actually receive, so the carrot, right, was for the program director to require this was that not only did their participants each get a certificate of completion that they could present to their program director, you know, or whoever else afterwards, but they also got a more detailed and individualized report for their site. So after all of this was done, I analyzed the data by site and I sent an aggregate de-identified report to each program director. And so that was sort of the give back for them requiring their trainees to participate, but we never said that you could only get those things if you required them to participate. So it was really supplied to everybody, but there were some programs that sort of committed in that way.
So a follow-up question then is, if it is required, which we tried, what are the consequences of not participating?
That was left up to the site. You know, to be honest, we had nothing to do with how or if they were going to enforce it. And I don't recall ever hearing from a site that they did anything in particular aside from just reminding their trainees that they needed to do it. And I'll let Prit jump in too, because she was part of our study team if I'm not remembering something. But at least here, you know, a lot of it was just, I think at the time, Devesh, who was the program director and also on the study team, you know, sort of reminding the trainees that they needed to complete it was part of their, I want to say it was part of their promotion checklist, if I'm not mistaken.
Neha,
Do you have any other questions from the group?
I do. You mentioned that these modules are now also published on OpenPediatrics. Is that true?
So we're starting to publish them on OpenPediatrics. The first one just went through its peer review process and is now in production and will soon be posted, and that was on ventricular peritoneal shunts. We are sort of slowly going through the process. It's been hampered a little bit obviously by what's happening right now. But the plan is to, over the next year to year and a half, get most of the modules that were involved in this particular study up on OpenPediatrics for people to utilize. So stay tuned.
Thanks.
That would be free of charge?
Free of charge. You have to sign up for an account. They actually have a multitude of resources that are really amazing. And the degree of like animation and graphic design and video it's really taken it up another notch. And so that's been really nice to have as well. They are, of course, all of these modules still available on MedEd portal for download in the original PowerPoint version.
How specific are the modules to physician trainees? Could they be used for other non-physician trainees, for example?
You know, I personally think they could be. You know, they're mostly geared towards care of these patients when they're in the inpatient setting. But that being said, the objectives in terms of what content was included, I think could span across disciplines. So for example, you know, I think there's something to be learned in all those modules by people that might be in non-medical fields or potentially even people that interact with patients but don't directly impact their patient care. So for example, the device-related modules might be helpful for like a nursing student or a nurse practitioners, PAs. occupational therapists, physical therapists. So like any provider that might come into contact with these patients who may or may not be involved directly in patient care, I think could gain something from looking at these modules. In addition, medical students, really at any stage of their training, and pediatric trainees or other trainees that take care of children like family practice.
So this is Naomi. Neha, have you ever shared any of this with the School of Health Sciences, PA, OT, and PT departments?
Not to date, I have not.
Okay, I'm going to chat you the person you need to talk to.
Great, thank you. Also, I am happy to have people email me, or even if you want to actually set up a time to talk with me about this project and my experience, I would be happy to do that. It was a labor of love. I poured my heart and soul into this project, and the people around me did the same, those that helped me, and it's been just such a wonderful journey to see where this has come and the impact that it's had. So I'm always happy to talk about this.
Dr. Shah, this is Eileen. Thank you for the presentation. I think I might have misunderstood, but initially they consented. The consent was obtained by just having them agree to the content when they opened up, that by participating they gave consent. But it sounds like it was actually a requirement. So could you review that just one more time?
Sure.
Because I think I misunderstood you.
Yep, so I think I wasn't probably clear. They received, when they initially logged into the site and got their user-specific password, like their unique ID and their password, the first screen that they faced was information about the study. And then what they were asked to do was they had to click a box that said that they would opt into research or opt out of research. If they did not want to participate in the research study, all they needed to do was click that they did not want to participate in the research study, and then they would be allowed to access the curriculum at will for their own education. But the data was not collected.
That makes sense. Yeah.
So that way, what we did was, even if it was a requirement by the institution, it was a requirement for their educational purposes, but not to participate in the research study. Is that clear?
Yes, and that makes sense. I think that's a creative approach. Yeah, thank you.
Are there any other questions?
Neha, I just wanted to double check because I see that Annie has put your email into the chat box. There's no 4, correct? It's just Ensha.
Yeah. So let me see if I can do this. Yeah, now it's on there multiple times. Yeah. So feel free to write me.
I looked it up.
Yeah.
I looked it up in Outlook and it had a 4 on there. So, okay.
So again, I want to thank everybody for having me and for spending this hour with me. I know, these days it's hard to be on Zoom for a long period of time, and we all have lots of Zoom meetings. So I appreciate all of you dialing in and listening to my story.
Neha, thank you so very much. This was great.
And I want to echo thanks from the center, and also to highlight the new educational SIG special interest group that you both are leading, right? Am I right?
Benny Choksey is my
Benny,
partner. Yep.
Benny, sorry, my apologies. Neha has enough to do. Dr. Shah has enough to do. So this was meant to be a highlight of educational research as we broaden our scholarship definitions and mission. So thank you, because I've been getting offline texts about how valuable this is for those engaged in this research. So I just want to thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.